Everybody hear me? Hey, good? All right. Let's go ahead and turn to, we're going to do two parables parallel today. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 14, Luke 14, and Matthew 22. That's Luke 14 and Matthew 22. Bear with me because I got to use them both. Well, we're going to see that here in a second. There's some things about them that are in parallel, and there's some things about them that are a little bit dissimilar. So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this morning, we're going to look at the idea here that Jesus is going to give two parables on different occasions, but he's giving two parables, and both of them are going to talk about the concept of being ready and the reception that's going to be when the word of the Lord comes to people, what how receptive they are to it, and the fact that some people are going to receive it and some people are not. So that's kind of the overarching theme behind the two. So let's look at these just a couple of moments this afternoon, and we'll see if we can't glean a little bit from them. All right. So Luke chapter 14, and Luke chapter 14 starting in verse 15. So Luke 14, verse 15, starting in verse 15, and then Matthew 22, starting in verse 1 through 10. Okay. All right. And let's see. 15 through 20, 15 to 24. Okay. All right. Those are two portions of Scripture. So let's look at this. Let's go to Luke 14 first, the first one. Let's look at that one first. When Jesus is here, if you actually start back up at the first part of chapter 14, it says, "It came to pass as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread with him on the Sabbath day, that they watched him." So we know this is a case where he's together with, it says the house of one of the chief Pharisees. So we know that the Pharisees were one of the groups that were trying to eliminate his presence, but one of the things they do is they tested him, they tried him, they invited him to their house. In many cases, they were very hospitable, but it was always with the intent of trying to find something with which they could destroy him. All right. So there was a little bit of subterfuge in what they were doing. All right, it was a point of bringing him in, figuring out a little bit more about him, maybe trapping him in some way, and then finding a way that they could destroy his influence. In Matthew chapter 22, this is not a case where they're eating together. This is a case where he's being confronted by them. It's right after where he had, after we done the last week, where the wicked vine dressers had sent, the master had sent his servants, then another set of servants, and then sent his son, and that was the case in this. So two different things going on here, but the parables really parallel each other really well. So let's look at this. In Luke 14, verse 15, it says, "And when one of them that sat at meat with him," remember he's eating at the Pharisee's house, "one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he said unto him, Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." That's a very reasonable statement, right? Okay, that is what we want. That's the end result. That's what we want to do more than anything else. Not the physical eating of bread, certainly, because that's not what's going to happen. But the idea of supping, partaking around the table of God. All right, it's the same thing that David prayed for from the Lord. Prepare me a table in the presence of mine enemies. Prepare me, allow me to eat bread before you. That should be the goal of all of us, is to eat bread in the presence of the Lord. But he says, and he said to him, Jesus said, "A certain man made a great supper and bade many meaning what? Invited them, told them to come, bid them to come. And he sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all began with one consent, began to make excuse. Now, here's something that a lot of times I don't think we look at in the way of the parable here. These men conspired with one another to not go to this man's supper. The idea of consent here means they began with agreement with one another to not go to this supper. So one of them may have said, well, you tell him this, I'll tell him this, and I'll tell them this. And they've conspired amongst themselves to not go to this supper that they have been invited to, with one consent. They began to make excuse. The first one said, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray, have me excused. So it's certainly a reasonable request. The problem is this. They had already agreed to come to supper. And when you make an agreement to come, you are obliged to continue. You're obliged to follow through with it. And they have made an excuse not to come. Not that this has actually happened. We don't even know if these excuses are valid. These are the excuses that they've made. So they all began to make excuses. Another one said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them or to test them, to try them, to make sure that they are what I've purchased. I pray, please have me excused. Once again, another excuse. Any other time, that excuse would have been perfectly understandable. But we know that this was simply that, an excuse not to come to the supper. There's a reason they didn't want to go. And another said, and this is certainly an understandable one, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Now, I'm not sure why you wouldn't know that was going to happen, but apparently this is the excuse that they've used to avoid coming to this man's supper. I've married someone. I can't go. You know, she wants me to stay here with her, and I don't know if it's a long journey that I don't want to take, and I don't want to be separated from her. I don't know why he couldn't pack her along and all of them go. It doesn't matter. The whole point was this was an excuse that they used to avoid the supper. That's the key. So that master came, and he showed his Lord these things. In other words, he told his Lord all of these excuses. He told the master of the house, these men that you have invited for who knows how long. Typically, this was not something you didn't phone people the day before and say, hey, I'm going to have a get-together. This is something that had been planned for some period of time. There's a lot of thought and preparation that went into these things. This man has been preparing and has been carefully tending an animal that he's going to slaughter and have food for them. Food has been prepared, desserts have been prepared, bread has been baked, the wine has been pressed. Everything is ready for these men. The preparations, all of this hard work that goes into having a supper like this has been done. All the hard work has been done. All he's asking them to do is come and partake. All the hard work has been done for you. You just need to come and eat my meal with me. And this goes right back into what this man says to Jesus. Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. So here's what Jesus is alluding to here. The Lord has invited you to come and eat bread. He's prepared this for you. But here you are making excuses why you're not going to come and eat bread in the house of the Lord, at the Lord's table. I've already done all this for you. All you have to do is come and eat. But here you are making excuses why you won't. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in hither the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind. All right. Kind of a what, many times we would probably think of that as an overreaction, wouldn't we? You prepare this food, this good food, this fine dining experience, this good fellowship for, whoever, and they don't come. Typically, we don't say, well, you know what, then if you're not going to come, I'm just going to go down the road, and whatever homeless person I come across, I'm just going to pack him in the car, we're going to go and eat this food. That's not typically what we would think about. We would think this might be a little bit of an overreaction, and maybe it is. But at the end of the day, he has prepared this fine dinner, and now it sits, and if that was the case, let's think about this for just a moment. If the Lord sends back his word, remember he said it will never come back to him void. What the Lord sends out is always going to come back to him, and it will always have availed something. So what he was saying here is the word, the message of the Lord is coming out. The message of salvation is going out. The message of the hour is going out. It will not come back to me void. If you will not partake of it, someone will. So I'm going to go to the people who are going to be truly grateful for what I am going to give them. These are the people. These men that he's invited, these are people who could have just to turn around and invited him back. But now he's going to go to the people who could not return the favor to him, and he's going to invite them. Now, we're going to start looking at the allegory here in just a couple of moments. But the servant said, Lord, it is done as you have commanded, and yet there is what? Still room. The hall is still empty. We've invited everybody that we could find on the highways and byways, and there's still room. Still plenty of food. There's not enough people to eat everything. So what does he say do? The Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. So there was a purpose behind what he was doing. The purpose is to fill his house. The purpose was to fill his house. So he said, all right, I've still got plenty of food. My word will not come back to me void. My preparations will not come back to me void. So go out everywhere. Compel them to come in. For I say unto you that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. All right, so that's the first parable. This is what we've read. All right, this shows where the master of the house, while the people that were invited will never come and eat this supper with him. It's more, in this case, we see where he has excluded them. But we understand the message he's trying to get across is that these people would never have accepted his invitation. They never will come to him. Not that he's excluding them, it's the fact that they've excluded themselves. They've made excuses why they won't come. So they themselves are saying, we will never go to this. And that's the purpose behind, that's what he's saying. These men shall not taste of it because they've decided that they won't. I've invited them, they will not come. All right, so let's look at the second parable in Matthew chapter 22. And then we'll look at the similarities and where they're dissimilar in certain areas. Yeah.
And sort of debunk this thing about everybody's going to heaven.
Oh yeah,
they're not going to partake of it.
Well, there are people who look. There's two different ways that people will look at it. One is the correct way, and one is, of course, an incorrect way. The way, of course, that we look at it is the people that were originally invited. There are those that will never partake of it. Then there are those who say that this specifically excludes the Jews, that all people who claim Christianity are saved. But the Jews are excluded. But we know that's not really the case. Anyone who is invited is invited. He invited the Jews, he invited the Gentiles. There were Jews who accepted the invitation and went, and of course there were the Gentiles. And of course, we'll get to that here in just a couple of moments. But that idea here would certainly exclude the idea of once saved, always saved. All right, so Matthew chapter 22. Here's the second parable. This is the parable. This is a little bit different. This is under a different circumstance, but it still invokes the idea of a feast that's been prepared. And Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables, and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. All right. So we know there's a time of great excitement, right? There's a time of rejoicing. The wedding to take place. A king's son is getting married. The prince is becoming wed. And he sent out his servants. Now, it's interesting that he uses the term marriage, because we'll get to that here in a moment. The idea of the son being married to the bride. Okay. And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come. Again, he sent out other servants, saying, Tell those who are invited, See, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding. But they made light of it and went their ways, one went to his farm, another to his business. And then the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. Then he said to his servants, The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore, go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite them to the wedding. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both bad and good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to him, Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. And the king said to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. And that verse 14 really kind of sums up the parables. Many are called, but few are chosen. Many are called, but very few are actually going to be are going to enter in. Okay. All right. So let's look at this for just a couple moments. We got a couple things. Here's some similarities. All right. What are some similarities between the two? What do I know? Okay. There was both a time of festivity. All right. One, it was just a simple matter of I've prepared a dinner, I've sent out invitations, I have this dinner that's going to happen, and I've invited specific people to come to this dinner. Another one, we have an idea of a festivity. There's going to be a wedding. And then as now, weddings were a big deal, especially the wedding of the king's son to a young lady. This would have been a time of the entire kingdom would shut down while this wedding feast was going on, and it would be I don't know. It's been a while, but the last one I remember, of course, was the wedding of Princess Diana and Prince Charles. Even the last one, Prince William was not as big as the one. Charles and Diana was just huge, and the entire country just sort of shut down for a period of time, and it was almost like a week-long event, this big deal, televised and everything like that. Well, on a slightly lesser scale, that's exactly what's happening. There's a big event that's happening, a large event. We would look at this as the idea of the day of the Lord. Not Judgment Day. The idea of the day of the Lord is there are many days of the Lord. Some people would say that this is the Lord's day. Of course, every day is the Lord's day. But there were different days there was going to be a day of the Lord in the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., right? There was a day of the Lord where the Holy Spirit was going to come. There was a day of the Lord in which Jesus Christ was going to die on the cross. The day of the Lord is something in which the Lord's name is going to be magnified. This idea of the feast and festivity is not Judgment Day, but it is a day of the Lord. Something big is going to happen here. Something large, something magnificent is going to occur. All right, what else? We both have, Okay. Not only have they invited guests, but they've been tiered, right? You have one, then you got two, and then you have three. There's a tier, right? All right, the first one we have what? There would be people who would be, it was specific. It was a narrowly defined group of people, all right? What we would call VIP. All right? We know that the VIP, what? Who? Okay. All right. Next, we have who? Let's define this a little bit further. Let's define this a little bit further because I think we can actually narrow it down a little bit further. To narrowly define the idea of the VIP. These were people that would have been considered to be, they all were, and I want to make sure I say this correctly so people don't think that there's some sort of a hierarchy as far as that's concerned. These are people that would have been expected. For example, the Pharisees, scribes, the priests. These would have been people that you would have expected to come to the king's wedding, to the rich master's wedding. These were the people that, if anybody was going to be invited, these are the people that are going to be invited. You know, even today, if you go, especially in larger cities, you see these VIP events that the city hall puts on, or the mayor puts on, or the city council does, or any of these things like this. There are people that you know are likely going to be invited, and you're probably going to see there. This is who he's speaking of here. All right. Then you have the second tier. Okay, they're like the let's say C-list. Okay, they're the C-list celebrities. I know this is just a human standpoint, but the idea. Look at what he calls. He says, "Go out and find the lame, the sick, the poor." Okay, this was the rank and file. This was the everyday. The Jewish people. These were the people that they weren't the second. And I'm trying to make sure I say this because I don't want to say it incorrectly. We're not necessarily looking to ascribe a specific value to every single thing in a parable. Remember, there's a danger in doing something like this. But he does delineate between those who were specifically invited, those who were compelled to come in, and then last of all, going into the highways and hedges and finding those people. Okay, you have these. These were, let me call that the rank and file, so to speak. And then the last, you have who? The Gentiles. That's who that means. Okay? There were people who were invited to come. They refused to come. And he says, I want you to go out and get everybody else. He says, we've gotten all this, and there's still room. Now I want you to go out everywhere. Go out and compel them to come in. Go out and scour the countryside looking for people who will come to my feast because it's plenty of food, and I don't have enough people to fill my house. Okay? So we've got that. That's another similarity. What's the other similarity? There's a wealthy, let's say a master, all right, or king. Of course, we understand that master and king is God. And then there is a servant. And that servant is who? All right. Some people might even say it's the Holy Spirit. Okay. But in any case, you have these similarities. Now, last but not least, the feast and the festivity. In the grand, when we start looking at that, what can we take that to mean? That means there's a time that the Lord is calling the people, and they have not come. All right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
You know, I was sitting last night and I worked all these hours and I can't come. Then the other one is like going to all the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm just trying to put something back in my lifestyle.
I would even go so far as to say the idea of an excuse, and certainly we particularly as Christians, we can make excuses for why we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. But you could also look at for the idea of people making excuses why they will not obey, why they will not obey the gospel. You know, my parents were XYZ denomination. My parents would roll over in their grave if they knew that I was going to start attending the Church of Christ and get baptized. You know, my preacher, my husband, my wife, whoever it might be. Many times it's an excuse about why they will not obey while they will not obey at all. Then after we become Christians, there are excuses that we make why we are not faithful. And excuses that we give for not becoming members of the Lord's church or not remaining faithful and remaining active in the Lord's church are just as weak as the excuses that we read here. They're just as weak. They are manufactured excuses. Because let's be honest. If, for example, your family was whatever denomination they were, and you know the truth. If you know your family, and your family, you know, we talk about it, they love me, they would roll over in their grave. Let's ask the honest question. Would they roll over in their grave, or would they be like the rich man saying, send someone back to my brothers and tell them this so they don't end up in the same place I am? We're being what's that? Yeah, okay. But knowing what we know, would your family be, would they want you to say, no, we were always this, I'm always going to be this, or would they want you to obey and become a New Testament Christian? It certainly would. It certainly would. If someone dies unsaved, you know that they're in the same position as that rich man and Lazarus. And that rich man he knew where he was, and he knew that his brothers were going to be in the same place because they were just like him. So they would absolutely, he had forgotten about his own promise. He said, look, just make sure my brothers, I love my brothers. I don't want them to be in the same place. Send someone back. He says, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. No, but even if someone goes back from the dead, Jesus came back from the dead. People still didn't want to listen to him. He said, even if somebody comes back from the dead, they won't hear Moses, and if they won't hear the law and the prophets, then they're not going to listen to someone who comes back from the dead. Okay? So let us put these things. There are excuses made. Okay, there are excuses made. Excuses for not obeying, and there are excuses for a lack of faith and a lack of growth on our part. Certainly so. Both of those fall into play. I work hard, and Sunday's my only day, and I want to I want to spend it doing this. I want to spend it on my own time. I want to spend it on me. And the truth of the matter is the reason that you have a day off and the reason that you're able to take care of yourself is because of God. The least you can do is give Him that day. Give Him those couple of hours. Give Him something. He's the one that's giving you what you have. Give Him something back. All right, so those are our similarities. What? Yeah, the feast went on without fail. Which tells us what? God is consistent and God is a keeper of His promise, right? God's going to it's going to happen whether the people that were originally invited, He didn't throw up His hands and say, well, nobody came, we'll just be done. Like last night, we could have said, well, not everybody that we invited, not everybody that said they were going to come came, so we're just going to go on home. No. We had fun with the people that came. We enjoyed our time together. It was great. It's the same way with this master. This landowner, this king. He says, I've prepared something. I'm not giving this up simply because the people that I wanted to come, the people that I invited specifically to come, have refused my invitation. I'm not going to do that. He says, I want you to go out and find everybody. And that gets back into the idea here is that if we look at this from, of course, the spiritual standpoint, there were those who were invited to come, and they had been invited from the very beginning. And those were the people, those were the children of God, those were the Israelites, those were those who lived under the law and died under the law, and there they are. Then you have people that were born under the law, but then lived the time of Christ, under Christ's law. They were born under the old law, but they lived and they died under the law of Christ. Guess what? There they are. They were invited as well. Then we have people who were born and will die under the law of Christ, like us. And there we are. We're the Gentiles. We're the last ones here. We're not anymore. There's no Jew or Gentile. But that's where we would have found ourselves. We were born under the law of Christ. We'll die under it. But we're just as invited. The people that were originally invited didn't want to go. We're there because God was not going to be satisfied with His word coming back to Him void. He said, I'm going to send it to the Gentiles. The entire world is going to be blessed because my people are going to ignore my invitation. It makes sense? Makes sense. All right, now let's look at a couple of dissimilarities because there's a couple things in here where it's especially in the one in Matthew chapter 22, because there's a little bit of there's some unexpected violence, so to speak. Okay, so he says they made in verse 5, but they made light of it and went their own ways, made their excuses. One went to his farm. He bought the oxen. The other went to his business. He bought a plot of land. He had to go and look at it. Doesn't talk about the man who got married. Apparently that wasn't an excuse. Verse 6, it says, and the rest, here's the problem. This is where the parable takes a left turn that is kind of unexpected. It says, the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. Who's this? Yeah, prophets under the old law. Remember, the prophets went and they prophesied about this. They prophesied about the coming of the day of the Lord, the day that the Lord was going to be magnified. And what did they do to those prophets? Sometimes they killed them. They certainly treated them spitefully. Not one of those prophets was welcomed. Like we said, the only time we see where a prophet was just welcomed with open arms was Jonah. He's the only one where they said, thank you for coming. We repent in sackcloth and ashes. We don't want this calamity to come up. The pagans put more stock in what the prophet of the Lord said than his own people put in the words of the Lord. Okay? So we know that they were treated spitefully, killed in many cases in horrible ways, sawn in half, stoned, hung, burned, treated horribly. But what did he do? He kept sending prophets. He kept sending prophets. He kept sending prophets. He kept sending prophets. And they treated them spitefully. So when does it happen? It says when the king heard about it, he was furious. Oh, let me tell you, that was under the old law. Under the new law, what happened to the apostles? Those who were sent out, who were inviting people to come in and partake of the feast. All but one died were murdered. Some of them were murdered by the Jews. Some of them were murdered by the Roman authorities. Some of them were murdered by the places that they were sent because they didn't understand what they were talking about, and they felt that they were insulting their gods, and of course they took their life for it. But in any case, they spitefully treated his servants. It says, but when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. What did he do? What can we reasonably assume? It certainly approaches that. What city was destroyed? Jerusalem. In 70 AD. He said, I'm going to destroy their city. He said, and it said that there's not a Christian that lost their life, but plenty of the Jews who were living there that still held to the old law were slaughtered by the Romans when they came in. Titus came into the city and sacked the city, destroyed the temple, leveled it completely. As Jesus said, there weren't two stones laying on top of one another. Everything that was of value in that temple was carried off, and the temple was never, ever rebuilt. This is the idea. He's destroyed the murderers and burned up their city. The people who spitefully treated the very messengers that were sent to gather them into the feast were the ones that the king was furious with and he destroyed. So there's our answer. That's where you see the one parable goes this way, the other one goes this way. That's the answer. But at the end of the day, it was still the same thing. He rejected the people that he had sent. He said, these people will never taste my feast. They will never come in. They will never come into my house after I've bidden them come in. They will not come in. Now, was a reason behind that. They chose not to. So what does that tell us about today? Whose choice is it to go to the feast? It's our choice, right? Always ours. When he says he compel them, doesn't mean you round them up and force them at the point of a spear or a gun or however you want to look at that. The idea of compelling means what? Entreating. You entreat the same way we approach people with the gospel today. We entreat with them. We don't round them up and force them to march them in there and march them down into the water and march them back up again and say, well, we've accomplished the goal. We've baptized a lot of people, and now these people, they're no more Christians than my dog if I threw it in the water. They're not Christian. When it says to compel, it means to give them evidence, to teach them and to show them that to refuse this is to invite destruction upon yourself. Think about that for a second. You have your choice. You can either come to the feast or you can be eternally punished. You can come to a feast that's been prepared for you from the beginning of time, that's being put on by the greatest host ever, it consists of food and delicacies and things that are indescribable in a spiritual sense. You can either take advantage of that or you could suffer eternal punishment. Which one sounds better to you? Sounds good, right? We like to eat. Listen, if nothing else, the church likes to eat, right? Why is it so many people refuse the invitation? They make excuses. Fake excuses. I mean, excuses that don't even hold water. You're telling me that not one of these things these people said they were going to do, they couldn't wait until after about a week-long feast at this man's house. Every single one of them. Every single one of them. But with consent, with one consent, they began to make excuses. To specifically avoid going. People today specifically make excuses as to why they will not obey. It's as baffling now as it was then. Some of them make no sense. I want to continue to engage in this kind of behavior that I know it's self-destructive. I know that it's going to hurt me. I know that it's going to hurt everyone else. But I cannot and I will not stop doing it. My loyalty to my family and to this denomination is too much for me to give up, and I cannot and I will not give it up. But the excuses are many, but not one of them holds water. You know, the Lord didn't look at those excuses and say, well, that's reasonable. It's okay. Don't worry about it. You know, next time I'll invite you next time. Not one of those was an excuse that the Lord looked at and said, okay, that's a reasonable one. I think I can let that one go. But there we are. But at the end of the day, now see, here's the thing. In verse 10, Matthew 22 and verse 10, it says, so those servants did go out into the highways and to gather together all whom they found, both bad and good. And what does it say at the end? And the wedding hall was filled with guests. So once again, the word of the Lord does not return to him void. It accomplishes something. It accomplished something from the very beginning. There are those who will listen. They will accept the invitation. They will go to the feast. And his wedding hall will be filled with guests. That's a promise. The question is, are we going to be in that guest? And this kind of gets into the second. We're not going to get into that tonight or this afternoon because I didn't prepare anything on it. But verse 11, he says, you know, there's going to be a king that came in to see the guests. He saw a man that didn't have the wedding garment. That tells me that there are going to be people who are going to think that they're part of this feast, but they're not part of this feast. They just think they are. They've made a false assumption, and that's not the case. We know that's the idea that people who think they are saved, but they are not really saved. They've gone under a false assumption. That's all I have. Anything else? Anything, did you get anything out of it that you didn't have before? I just tell you what you'd already known for 30 years? That's okay. Part of Scripture is repeating the same thing over and over again. That's all right. I don't mind doing that. What's that? That's it. Same thing. That's how we remember stuff, right? Just say it over and over and over again. Well, you know, it's baffling to us. Of course, you know, it's. I wouldn't say it's easy, but you know, as Christians, we sit and we know we have the truth. And I think that's criticism a lot of people have us. You think you're the only ones that have the truth. I don't say we're the only ones that have the truth, but we have the truth. We do have the truth. Well, the acceptance of it. You know, it's easy for us to look at it and say, well, you know, we have the truth and how difficult it is for people. But at the end of the day, remember, he says, I'm not far off. If you look, you'll find me. But so many people want to look at the Bible on a very, very superficial level. They think that just the knowledge of Jesus is enough. The fact that they knew he existed. The fact that, yes, he died on the cross for my sins, but that's as far as I have to go with it. Just the speaking of his word somehow conveys salvation. And there's a real disconnect as far as the world is concerned on the way the Lord's word is given to us. But it's a disturbing thing, but it's the truth. It's the truth. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, we're going to be led in a song of invitation. That song is 763. 763. We're going to sing a song of invitation, and we invite anyone who needs the prayers of the congregation, anything we can do for you. We want to pray with you and for you while we stand. While we stand.